Welcome back everyone. Most Muslims who comment here on the channel do so without paying much attention to the videos, if they even watch them at all. So starting in this video, Muslims, if you want to object to something that you hear, and I'm sure you will, then refer to the time of the video in the minutes and seconds, quote what I say, and then state your response to it. If you cannot produce a comment like this, then I will take it as you not engaging with the video, and likewise, I will not engage with your comment. In this video, we will accomplish three major objectives. We will examine Jewish interpretive traditions about the biblical Joseph, we will describe how the Quran is a human creation, and we will describe how Jewish interpretive tradition meets the Quran's challenge. Of course, the challenge I'm referring to is to produce a surah like it. And of course, Allah, apparently feeling less secure about himself elsewhere, said, produce 10 surahs like it. Now, everyone knows the story of Joseph in Genesis. Remember, he gets sold as a slave, ends up in Potiphar's house, refuses the advances of Potiphar's wife, ends up in prison, and then out again because he can interpret dreams, and rises to some prominence in Egypt. That's a very short summary. Now, I don't like reading long bits of text in these videos because it slows them down, but it's actually necessary in this case because we're going to go through some exegetical expansions of the Joseph story that we see preserved in Jewish tradition. Midrash Tanhuma says, our sages inform us that on one occasion Potiphar's wife assembled a number of Egyptian women so that they might see how very handsome Joseph was. But before she summoned Joseph, she gave each of them a citrus and a knife. When they saw Joseph's handsome countenance, they cut their hands. She said to them, if this can happen to you, who see him only once, how much more so does it happen to me, who must look at him constantly? Each day she strove to entice him with words, but he suppressed his evil inclination. Whence do we know this? From what we read in the section, his master's wife cast her eyes upon him, Genesis 39:7. Now let's look at Midrash Hagodol. She put the righteous one, that is Joseph, in the mouths of all of them. It is related, when the queens and noble women returned from worshipping idols, they all went to visit Miss Potiphar. They said to her, why is it that you look so badly? Have you perchance been fancying that servant of yours? Whereupon she gave them bread and meat and knives, and brought in Joseph, and stood him before them. And when they lifted their eyes to Joseph, they cut their hands as they ate. She said to them, if you, before whom he has stood for but a moment, were unable to endure it, how much less able am I, who see him each and every day? They said to her, you have no remedy other than to say to his master, that is Potiphar, to lock him up in prison, and he will be entirely yours. She said to them, if I am the only one to speak against him to my husband, he will not believe me. But if each one of you tells your husband, Joseph seized me, then I will tell my husband that Joseph seized me as well, and he will put him in prison. Potiphar's wife gathering her friends together is a very important detail. We'll call it the assembly of ladies, so keep that in mind as we go throughout the video. Also, there are certainly some puzzling details in these stories, but we'll talk about those more as we go through the material. But for now, let's look at the Quran's version. And the women in the city said, the wife of Al-Aziz is seeking to seduce her slave boy. He has impassioned her with love. Indeed, we see her to be in clear error. So when she heard of their scheming, she sent for them, that is the assembly of ladies, and prepared for them a banquet, and gave each one of them a knife, and said to Joseph, come out before them. And when they saw him, they greatly admired him, and cut their hands, and said, perfect is Allah. This is not a man. This is none but a noble angel. She said, this is the one about whom you blamed me, and I certainly sought to seduce him, but he firmly refused. And if he will not do what I order him, he will surely be imprisoned, and will be of those debased. Now for the natural question, which came first? Well, the dates of composition for the Midrashim are very difficult to determine and honestly not very useful. For example, James Kugel suggests a 7th to 8th century date for Midrash Tanhuma, which we heard from earlier. However, these Midrash are not simply composed on the spot from nothing. They're actually, in many cases, a collection of much earlier material. And this is what's indicated by phrases like these that we saw earlier. Our sages inform us. This indicates a tradition is being passed down, so the tentative dates of composition really don't help us out. However, the form and details of these stories do. So let's take a look at one such detail. Let's look at Joseph's prison. According to the Midrash HaGodel, the assembly of women suggests that Joseph be locked up in prison so that he will be entirely hers. And the Quran says that he will be imprisoned and will be of those debased. In the Midrash, it's a rather unique detail. It's as if Potiphar has a prison in his house where Joseph can be locked up and have no place to run from Potiphar's wife. In the Quran, this has been smoothed out. Prison is a form of punishment. Potiphar's wife threatening Joseph is alluded to elsewhere in Jewish tradition, like commentary on Psalm 146 and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. But what does this all tell us? When we compare the Bible and the Midrash and the Quran, everything crumbles when we get to the Quran. You see, Joseph has to end up in prison. This is what happens in the Bible, and so this sets the limits on what Jewish tradition can interpret by reading in between the lines. However, the assembly of ladies has to fit in there somewhere. James Kugel elucidates the problem. Now in the Quran, this is handled very awkwardly. Miss Potiphar seizes Joseph in the garment scene, and he flees. Then comes the accusation of attempted rape, which is immediately and publicly disproved. Then comes the assembly of ladies. Then Joseph, as something of an afterthought, is jailed in spite of the fact that he has been proven innocent. The Midrash HaGodel version is exegetically much better, because improbable as the private little dungeon scenario might appear, it at least gets Joseph into prison as a result of what is said at the assembly of ladies. Namely, they said to her, "You have no better remedy than to say to his master to lock him up in prison, and he will be entirely yours." You see his point. In the Quran, Joseph was proven innocent and acknowledged by all. Her husband saw his torn shirt, and he said, "This is the woman's plan. Joseph, ignore this." And to his wife he said, "Ask forgiveness for your sin. You were sinful." The women in the city agreed, saying, "We see her to be in clear error." Everybody knows Joseph is innocent, yet he is still jailed. This makes no sense. She said he will surely be imprisoned and will be of those debased. The Quran's version is simply illogical. The detail about Potiphar's private little dungeon was apparently unacceptable for the authors of the Quran, and so they changed the story, perhaps adapting from prior Jewish tradition to make prison a threat. About this incoherence, Kugel says, "For what had worked so well in the Bible, and even tolerably well in Midrash HaGodel, now fell apart entirely in the Quran." The Quran draws from a number of sources, and in many cases, it's Jewish tradition. We've covered this in great detail elsewhere on this channel. Check the pinned comment for more examples. The problem with this is that the Quran claims that it affirms the Torah and the Gospel. Yet it spends very little time doing so, and a lot of time confirming folklore, legend, and midrash, as we've seen in this video. But this story of Joseph provides perhaps the most clear example. As is so often the case with Quranic recycling of biblical stories, there is no indication that the book's author sought or was even able to distinguish biblical text from exegetical elaboration, or to distinguish both of these from later flourishes that had been added for no exegetical reason at all. What's an example of one of these later flourishes? Well, we've seen it a couple of times now. From the Quran, she gave each one of them a knife, and they cut their hands. And from the Midrash, she gave them knives, and they cut their hands. Now, this could refer to being so distracted by Joseph's good looks that they cut their hands inadvertently while they were eating. It could also refer to them cutting their hands as a testimony that if they were in the place of Potiphar's wife, they would act the same way. Now, Muslims will want to claim that this story is historical, even though it's not in the Bible, because the Quran clearly presents it as historical, and that this history was simply preserved in Jewish texts. But what we're going to do now is go through the Hebrew of Genesis 39 and see that this is not historical material. We're actually going to look at what gave rise to these exegetical expansions, and we're going to see that they are nothing more than the products of esoteric exegesis. And it came to pass after these things, that's devar in parentheses, Genesis 39:7. Devar can mean word, matter, or thing, just basic Hebrew vocabulary. So let's put word in the translation instead. And it came to pass after these words. But now we have to ask, after what words? No words were spoken in the preceding verses. So Jewish tradition came along later and filled in the blanks. Genesis Rabbah, for example, tells us Joseph's unspoken words that he was thinking about at the time. As odd as this may seem, much of the Midrash that we saw earlier is based on this exact verse. Whence do we know this? From what we read in the section, his master's wife cast her eyes upon him. A rabbinic interpretation can be somewhat bizarre, so let's look at another example so we're properly introduced. She called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." So hold on tight. We have a couple of things to note. And she said to them contains the word lamor, which you see in red, and he brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. So lamor and this plural pronoun us. Lamor actually has a bit of history in rabbinic exegesis. A good example is the Ten Commandments, which are counted quite differently in some Jewish tradition because it does contain lamor. But here in our text in Genesis 39:14, lamor combines with this plural pronoun to give us this. She put the righteous one, that is Joseph, in the mouths of all of them. According to some traditions, in using the inclusive plural pronoun, Potiphar's wife is trying to convince the assembly of women to empathize with her. She's a victim of Joseph. In other interpretations, she's telling the assembly of women to go home and likewise accuse Joseph in front of their husbands. You can see that these interpretations vary because they're reading something into the text that's not there. Now, did you notice what I said a couple of seconds ago about Miss Potiphar trying to convince the assembly of women to empathize with her? You must have noticed by now, in this text in Genesis, there are no other women. One day Joseph went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." The Hebrew word for servants is actually man, but this is precisely the starting point for our assembly of ladies. So let's explore an alternate interpretation. Here we have the same verses that you just heard with a separation in them and a reinterpretation of verses 13 through 15. Of course, the female household members, the assembly of ladies, would be the same ones who cut their hands with knives. So after verse 12, we have an unspecified period of time, and then since she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called out to, or instructed, there's our lamor again, the assembly of ladies. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us." That would be the plural pronoun referring to the assembly of ladies. Additionally, taking the men of Genesis 39:14 to be women resolves the apparent tension, where there were men of the household in verse 14, but none in verse 11. I've now given you several examples showing how these interpretations were derived, and I hope that it's clear. It's interesting to note also that there are more primitive forms of this exegesis of Genesis 39 available to us in sources that predate the Midrashim that we've looked at in this video. James Kugel talks about this in his book as well. This is, again, a problem for Muslims who want to date the Jewish traditions late and the Quran early to avoid allegations of borrowing. Can't be done. As Kugel notes, it should by now be clear that, as Ginsburg noted, the Jewish origin of this story is beyond dispute. The Quran is borrowing from Jewish tradition, not the other way around. We've now addressed our first objective and part of the second. We've examined Jewish interpretive traditions about the biblical Joseph and in part described how the Quran is a human creation. We've seen this part of the Joseph story as a product of exegetical expansion. It's not a historical event, yet the author of the Quran thinks that it is. This is often how these traditions work. As they become distant from their original context, the later authors who are dealing with this material have difficulty separating fact from fiction. And as we see in the Quran, the author had difficulty separating scripture from tradition. With respect to the third objective, describe how Jewish interpretive tradition meets the Quran's challenge. We've seen from our reading at the beginning of this video that Jewish tradition produced stories about Joseph just like the ones in the Quran. Allah's challenge has not only been met, but it has been surpassed. Remember, we saw the illogical way that the Quran incorporates Jewish tradition. For what had worked so well in the Bible and in the Midrash fell apart entirely in the Quran. It's ironic that Allah's open-ended and utterly unqualified challenge was answered definitively by the same sort of Jewish traditions from which much of the Quran itself is derived. I'll see you next time.